Hi, I'm Jason Odell, and this is the Sensor Plane Photography Podcast, where light and technology come together. Now, I know I've been away for quite some time. It's a little bit of catch-up, so I thought I'd fill everybody in with what I've been up to since the last episode, which has been quite a while. Did a couple of photo safaris, went down to Texas for birding, and also did 2 weeks in South Dakota with my colleague Deborah Sandage, and we had a wonderful time taking pictures of the landscapes of the South Dakota Badlands. I've got a few more photo safaris coming up in the fall. These are part of a new series called Digital Underground. And in the Digital Underground, Deborah Sandage and I are going to take you around to urban locations during the blue hour, twilight, do a lot of creative techniques that are going to be really fun. Things like long exposures, infrared, monochrome, HDR, all of this stuff in ways to explore places you may have been before in whole different ways. So I want everyone to take a quick look at that. Go out and check out the workshops tab on my website, luminescentphoto.com. Click on the Digital Underground Instructional Photo Tours link, and you'll see we've got workshops coming up in San Antonio, Texas, and Las Vegas, Nevada. Now, another project I've been working on was a guide to Lightroom. And this is something I've been really kicking around for the last several years, and it's just something that I've been able to really put together now. And I wanted to write a guide to Lightroom for people who are new to the software and coming over to that software from a different kind of workflow. Now, in digital photography, there's two kinds of workflows, and I want to go through some FAQs about Lightroom for those of you who may be thinking about moving over from a traditional workflow. Now, in photography, we got workflow combines a couple of different elements. We take the pictures with our camera, we move them into our computer, we organize our images, our photos as files in the computer. We also apply metadata, things like keywords, IPTC, location, copyright, that kind of stuff to our images. We view them, we triage them, we adjust them and process them, so usually with RAW, but we could be talking about any kind of image. And then we share them with our friends, our family, or we print them. And all of these things can be done with a variety of products, but I want to talk about some things about Lightroom if you're thinking about moving over to Lightroom. Now, I moved over from using primarily Capture NX2, a Nikon product, but I know that there's people interested in moving to Lightroom who are just using things like Bridge, Adobe Bridge and Photoshop, or also Apple's Aperture. So a lot of churn right now, a lot of people looking around for new products, especially with recent announcements that some products like Aperture, like Capture NX2, are not being supported going forward. So it's a time to really evaluate our workflow. Now, I want to talk a little bit for people who are using browser-based workflows, a little bit about the difference between a Lightroom workflow and a browser workflow. Okay, with a browser like Bridge, like Photo Mechanic, we look at image files stored in directories on your computer's hard drive. And we can browse by folder or subfolder, and sometimes we can look at the contents of a single folder, including all of its subfolders. But that's sort of the extent of it. We look at our images, and we view those images either using the embedded preview JPEG that's inside your RAW file, and Nikon, Canon, Fuji, all these cameras, they embed a JPEG preview, so you can use that to view the image as a thumbnail. Some browsers, like Bridge, will also use a RAW converter on the backside to process and create previews of your RAW images. Non-RAW images like TIFFs or JPEGs will always be previewed as they came out of your camera or as you saved them from, say, Photoshop. But there's some differences about a Lightroom paradigm and a browser paradigm. And the first biggest difference, and the question that I get is, where does Lightroom store my images? And that's a big question because people think that you've got to import your images into Lightroom, and doing so is going to move them around on your computer or hide them, and what do you do? Well, let me tell you something about the Lightroom paradigm, which is that it's based on a catalog, which is really a fancy way of saying a database. Now, this database is empty until we add images to it. or import in the Lightroom terminology. Now, that import terminology can be confusing because you think you're moving your pictures, when in reality, what you're doing is indexing your images. What do I mean? Well, think of Lightroom as a card catalog. And here's 3x5 index cards. You can have a whole stack of them. And if you were to go to your local library once upon a time, you would go to the card catalog, which would be a room, a bunch of file cabinets, little drawers, and you'd pull out little index cards. And on these little index cards, you could have the title, the location of where to find that book when you go off into the stacks. That book might be on the 3rd floor, tucked away somewhere. You had the Dewey Decimal System. Well, we've got a file path system. Information, a summary about the book, and maybe a picture of the cover. Well, that's exactly what Lightroom is going to produce when it indexes your images. It's got the file name, where to find the file on your hard drive, metadata, processing instructions, so a set of unique instructions that are non-destructive, and a preview, a little JPEG that it creates when you import the images. But what most people don't understand is that this process of importing is simply creating these little 3x5 index cards. You're not moving your images anywhere. So the cool thing is that if you're going to use Lightroom and moving to it, you can import all of your images in place in their existing file directories, wherever they might be on your computer. And they can be on one hard drive, multiple folders, multiple hard drives. That's the nice thing about having a database. So Lightroom is going to create all of these little 3x5 index cards, put them into the database, and that's what you're going to be then viewing when you open Lightroom. What you can't do, as compared to a browser, is just open Lightroom, point to a folder of new images that haven't been indexed, and view them and edit them and do those kinds of arrangements and adjustments to them. So that's something just to keep in mind. So just understand that the import process is really indexing. Now, another huge question that I get all the time from new users is, why do my images look different when I import them into Lightroom? And this is particularly true for people who've been processing their images in other editors like Capture NX2 or Bibble or whatever, or Aperture. Lightroom uses Adobe Camera Raw, ACR, as its core processing engine, and it's what it uses to generate the preview image, the preview JPEG, that is created when you index your images. So Camera Raw has its own way of interpreting your RAW file that's going to be different from any other RAW processor that you may have used. So if you're importing your existing images into Lightroom and you've processed them somewhere else, or even if they're coming in straight from the camera, they're not going to look like the little JPEGs on the back of your camera. Now, that always bothers people. It doesn't look as good as what they're used to, or they're confused. What I will say is that in the Lightroom Develop module, you can actually go in, change some settings around with respect to your camera calibration, change the profile that's used, and you can have Lightroom's ACR module, the Camera Raw module, emulate any of the Nikon picture controls, Canon settings, Fuji settings, whatever. So if you like a particular look out of the camera as your default, like camera standard or camera landscape, whatever it might have been, you can actually process your images in Lightroom to mimic that exact look. You just have to set it up, and that's one of the things that you can change as a default. Another big question that I get from new users is, what about sidecar files? Sidecar files are these little text files with usually with an extension .xmp, and they contain metadata and processing instructions. And there's a lot of programs like Bridge, like Photo Mechanic, and others that can read and write to sidecar files. And it's a way of storing metadata. But some people don't like sidecar files because they show up in your directory with all these ancillary files, and you say, well, what is this? Well, Lightroom, by default, does not use sidecar files. It stores all the metadata, all the ratings, stars, keywords, that kind of stuff, right inside the catalog database on those little 3x5 index cards that I was talking about. However, Lightroom will read XMP sidecar files, so if you've been putting metadata onto your images in a program that uses sidecar files, like Bridge, Lightroom is going to read that during import. And for advanced users, if you want to, you can have Lightroom export metadata to those sidecar files should you want to share them with others or view them in other browsers. So that's just something that you can do, but it's not a mandatory requirement of using the product, of using the program. What about different kinds of images? Question I get a lot is Lightroom only for your RAW files? Well, the answer to that is no. Lightroom can process and read RAW files from most cameras, but it's also going to display JPEGs, TIFFs, PNGs, even video files in its library module when you use the Lightroom environment. The cool thing about Lightroom, though, is if you use the Develop module to make adjustments to non-RAW files, those adjustments will be stored in the catalog non-destructively. So let's say you've got a JPEG or a TIFF image that you've brought in from Photoshop and you want to do a little exposure adjustment or white balance adjustment or even sharpening. You can apply those adjustments to the TIFF, the JPEG, whatever, even a PSD file, and they're applied non-destructively inside of Lightroom. You never bake anything into those files if you do that. Now here's a great question that I get too. Where's the Save button in Lightroom? We're very used, if you're using a browser-based workflow, you're very used to, you go to your image, you open it up, you launch it into, say, your editor, maybe Photoshop, maybe Capture NX, whatever it might have been. You make your adjustments, you save the file. There's no Save button in Lightroom. All of the adjustments, every time you add a keyword, change a rating, make a movement on a slider, change a develop setting, those adjustments are automatically saved in real time to the Lightroom catalog. You don't need to save anything. The only time you'd want to save something is when Lightroom calls export, and that's where we generate a copy in JPEG or TIFF format to share on the web, to email, to whatever. We can create a derivative copy of that file. Now, those are the main questions that I get. A lot of people say, well, why should I be forced to put everything in this container, this database, this catalog? And that's a great question because that's really where the fundamental issue comes in. You go to a browser, you just open it up. Your pictures are there in a folder on your computer. You look at them. It's great. With Lightroom, you've got that extra step. You've got to do the import step first before it can show you any of your images. And I realize that there's times when that might slow things down. But there's some things you can do with Lightroom once these 3x5 index cards are created. When you save pictures on your computer, they go into a folder, they're in a particular directory path, and we've got them in their little buckets there that we call folders or directories. And with a browser, we can look at the contents of folders. We can look at the contents of a folder, maybe a subfolder, whatever. But it's very hard to view things across multiple folders that aren't nested or aren't in subfolders, or folders across different hard drives on your computer. And this is where Lightroom and products that use a database become very useful. So the first thing is that we can choose in the Lightroom catalog to arrange our 3x5 index cards in any way that we want. We can display images from a folder, from a subfolder, from a top level with all of its subfolders. We can even display folders that aren't within other folders. So if I wanted to click on a couple of different folders that aren't nested together, they're not in the same directory path, Lightroom has no problem displaying those. It's just using the database to give me a view. But another cool thing you can start to do with your images when it comes to managing them for your workflow, if you've got them in a database, is we don't need to use the folder structure itself within our catalog. We can use that if we want to, but we can also create our own custom, what we might call virtual folders. And in Lightroom, those are called collections. A collection is a group of images that we can drag into this imaginary folder, and that folder only exists inside the catalog. So as long as we're in the catalog, you can view your images in any kind of organizational structure that you want to. The original files are still sitting in their normal folders. We never moved them. We didn't do anything to them. And that's very powerful because it allows us to create custom arrangements of images regardless of the location of your files. Another thing that Lightroom does is create something called a virtual copy. Now, for those of you using browser-based workflows, if you have a raw file and you process it one way, if you wanted to process it differently, let's say you wanted to make a black and white version of it, or use different tools, each one of those alternative files, you either had to send a copy to Photoshop and process it, creating a derivative file, a PSD file, or a TIFF, or you could do something like within Capture NX2, use versions, and you could make processing versions and store them inside the raw file. Or if you wanted to, you could duplicate your raw file and just process each one differently and have copies. But every time you do that, it's a little bit clunky. What Lightroom can do for you is create something called this virtual copy. And a virtual copy is a duplicate of our little 3x5 index card. So here's the same image. This one's a black and white. This one's in color. In the Lightroom catalog, we've duplicated the little 3x5 index card. But both of these have the same file name, other than this one says copy 1. They both point to the same original raw file in my directory structure, and I can move these around inside the Lightroom catalog, move them to collections, print from them, do whatever I want with them without duplicating the original file on the back end. So that's a very powerful technique for when you want to work with virtual copies of your images based off the same raw file or even the same TIFF file. You don't need to duplicate the actual photograph every single time. That's going to save you time, it's going to be faster, and it's going to save space on your hard drive. The last little cool thing about the Lightroom environment and why people might want to consider moving to it is printing. Printing has always been sort of a multi-step process. We take our raw file, we adjust it, and then you're going to size it for a particular print size. So we need a size, we need a resolution. You're going to do output sharpening on it. And generally what that meant is we would open the image, either create a version of it or send it to Photoshop, create an intermediate file or derivative file that's, here's our image and we've scaled it up to 16 by 24 and we've applied sharpening. We've got this gigantic layered Photoshop file that we're going to have as our print. Lightroom lets you skip that middleman altogether. If you go to Lightroom, you can print directly from your master files, your raw files, your TIFF files, and all of the resizing, the scaling, the resolution, and the output sharpening is done in the background automatically. So we never have to create that intermediate file. You can print directly from your raw files. You can even do soft proofing and make proof copies where you make a virtual copy, adjust that to match your print output without touching the adjustments on your master file. So those things in particular are very powerful reasons why, if you haven't started moving to one of these database catalog-based workflow products, you should consider it. So I chose to move to Lightroom back in 2012. I've been working on it diligently ever since. I made a lot of mistakes when I moved over, and that's why I wrote my latest ebook guide. My latest project was to write a guide, which I call Moving to Lightroom. And this ebook is available from my website, www.luminescentphoto.com, as an interactive PDF. And what I've done is I've used iBooks and I've just synced it with iTunes and copied it over to my iPad. So it works on an iPad, you can view it on a computer, and go through everything as bookmarked and indexed. But the reason why I wrote this guide was for a couple of reasons. One is to have a useful guide to how to process and manage your images in Lightroom. So this book has got a complete section on all of the steps for learning the new tools for developing and processing raw images in Lightroom. So if you're coming from another program, coming from Capture NX, you've got to learn a whole new tool set. This guide is going to help you with that. It's going to take you through the steps in the appropriate order, how to make global adjustments, local adjustments, sharpening settings, all that stuff is in here. But the real other thing that's important is for people who've been using other programs, say you're using Aperture, say you're using Bridge, say you're using Capture NX, and you've edited files elsewhere, What do you do with the images you've already edited? How do you do things to get your images into Lightroom, to do the import, to keep the rework to a minimum? There were a lot of lessons learned that I had when I put all my images into Lightroom, and what I took away from that is there's some useful best practices that I've developed. Things like getting your folder directory structures cleaned up, triaging your images, cleaning up your metadata, how to synchronize the color labels between your old program and Lightroom, make sure that all of that stuff comes over, and what to do about raw files that you've already processed. All that information is right here in the new Moving to Lightroom guide. And like I said, I hope that you'll take a few minutes, check it out. You can download for free the table of contents. If you want to see everything that's in that, you can just go to the website, click on the link to download the table of contents sample page. It also includes a complete set of Lightroom presets for the develop module that I made. And these include different styles like portraits, wildlife, landscapes, grunge look, and a whole set of sharpening presets, sharpening for landscape, sharpening for portraits, sharpening for cameras without anti-aliasing filters. All those settings you can install in your copy of Lightroom, and they're included with my new guide, as well as a bunch of brush presets for making local adjustments with the adjustment brushes. So I hope you check it out. Don't forget to check out the upcoming fall workshops at the Digital Underground. Go to my website, click the Workshops tab, find the Digital Underground link. It's going to be really fun. Again, co-led by myself and Deborah Sandage. Las Vegas in October, San Antonio, Texas in November. I hope to see you there. And until next time, thanks again.